Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth of four talks at Griffith Observatory here as part of our celebration of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 12 mission to the moon. Tonight, feels like night, doesn't it? We've been here a while. This afternoon's and final talk is on our future on the moon. What is next? Where are we headed? Are we back to stay? Can you go? Can I go? What are we going to do on the moon? What does NASA have planned for us, and what might the future look like? So I just will remind everyone that this is part of our celebration of just one of all of the missions of Apollo. Apollo 12, of course, was the second to land astronauts on the moon, and 50 years later, we're celebrating its anniversary. So we will have here at Griffith Observatory a program for every one of these missions. I think we're all looking forward to celebrating the Apollo 13 mission next April. That'll be quite a lot of interesting stories there. But for today, we've had a chance to look back, ask, did it really happen? Of course it really happened. Some of the fun stories of the actual mission, including having the launch get struck by lightning. That's exciting. And if you just heard Alan Ladwig's presentation on the future of our dream of spaceflight, is it something that you have to be an astronaut, or can you just be a regular citizen and go? And then finally, this program about our future on the moon. So let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Laura Danley. I'm the curator of Griffith Observatory. With me is Alan Ladwig, our guest for today, who has been at NASA headquarters on and off over the decades, including at one point the head of policy and plans for NASA, so he has a long-term vision. And of course, Tony Cook, our astronomical observer, is part of the All Space Considered team. So where we last left our story, we had asked the big achievement of landing on the moon with Apollo 11 and of course the other Apollo missions like Apollo 12. And a lot of times the Apollo missions are referred to as flags and footprints. That's all we really got done at the moon, planted a flag and left our footprints, because of course there isn't a lot of erosion on the surface of the moon, so those footprints are going to be around for quite some time. But are flags and footprints enough? Are we going to go back and actually start having maybe science research stations on the moon, maybe colonies on the moon, maybe hotels on the moon? What might the future hold? So this is one of the art pieces of art released by NASA. I really like this one just because they have this guy on the side of the crater here. Not what you really want to do with your astronaut, have him tumble down to the bottom of a crater if he should lose his balance. But anyway, what does the future look like? Well, of course, today we've been celebrating the Apollo program, but there is a new program at NASA dedicated to sending astronauts back to the moon called Artemis. How many in this room have never heard of the Artemis program? The majority. As I said earlier, every time I ask that question, it is the large majority, 80% or so of the audience has never heard of the Artemis program, and yet the Artemis program does exist and has the same goal and more goals as Apollo did, which is to send astronauts back to the surface of the moon. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that program. But first I want to dial back and look a little historically. This isn't the first time we've said we're going to go back to the moon. There were two other initiatives after the Apollo era, both by Presidents Bush, Sr. and Jr. One at the 20th anniversary, George H.W. Bush announced the SEI, Space Exploration Initiative, and then at the 35th anniversary, George W. Bush described the vision for space exploration. Both of them set out a path on how we might return to the moon and expand even beyond the moon. So the Space Exploration Initiative had, as part of its kickoff, a study done by Sally Ride, your former colleague, and then there was something called the 90-day study. I was on a NASA's Space Science Advisory Committee at that time, and the $500 billion price tag came back, and everyone said, oh, that's so much, much too much. we have to do a different study. Let's synthesize all the possible ways that we might do it. It's called the synthesis group, or the Stafford Commission. It was run by Tom Stafford. And in fact, I was on it, and that's how we first met. I was on the Stafford Commission and followed up with the Augustine Report. And the bottom line is there really was no way, no miracle cure that was going to make it not be expensive. And more or less, the initiative died.
Once that 500 billion figure came out, it was the kiss of death.
Yeah, well, they tried to resurrect it with a synthesis group, but it was not possible. It was a great experience for me, but that's not really the why it was done. And so 15 years later, seen with NASA Administrator O'Keefe, George W. Bush also tried to launch a similar idea, no pun intended on the launch thing, the vision for space exploration that was called the Constellation Program. And it had a rocket, just like the Saturn V, called Ares. It had a capsule, just like the command module called Orion. And it had a lander called Altair. And the short version on that one is that the Ares was to be developed out of the Saturn V kinds of technology, take the Orion crew capsule up and land through the Altair lunar lander. Well, that lasted through about 2009, and then it too lacked the support in Congress and in the public to be enabled. However, the launch vehicle, the Ares program, was morphed into a new rocket called the Space Launch System. And it's probably important at this time to comment that the shuttle stopped flying in 2011. So, oh, there it is. Yes. So we knew in 2009 when Constellation was being canceled that we didn't have a way even to get to the space station, and we didn't have an American launch capability. So there was an imperative to develop a rocket, the SLS, Space Launch System, which is at the heart and the basis of all of our exploration in space from NASA. So out of this was born the Artemis Program in recent years that would use the SLS rocket, which would rendezvous, so it's kind of a different architecture than the Apollo program, with something called Lunar Gateway, which is a small station in orbit around the moon that would serve as a module for people to come and go and attach, and also a module for things to detach from the space station, go to the surface and come back, sort of a transportation node for lunar exploration. So, Tony, do you want to tell us a little bit more about Artemis and its goals? It's going to the South Pole, is it?
That's right. Part of the purpose for Artemis would be to look for resources on the moon to support people living there, possibly to generate fuel for lunar and even Mars missions in the future. So the first flight with people around the moon would be the Artemis 2 mission, and that would just actually loop around the moon, orbit around the moon, change orbit, and then head back to Earth. Artemis 3 would actually carry a crew to the south pole of the moon, and people would be able to explore the moon there, then come back, and then after that it's a little hazy, I think.
So, yeah, but indeed, there are 3 missions. Now, bear in mind, we talked earlier today about the number of Mercury missions, of Gemini missions, and then Apollo missions. The Artemis architecture is 3 missions. The first is Artemis 1, which will test the command and service module. It is uncrewed. It's just to send the hardware around the moon and come back 25 days later, thereabouts. So this complicated chart, can you boil it down for us? Tell us about Artemis 1?
Yeah, basically it would fly around the moon and change orbits. It would actually be able to maneuver quite a bit to show the capabilities of the Orion spacecraft before it would head back to Earth.
I think it's also worth noting one of the differences about Artemis and Apollo was there's a much bigger emphasis on women astronauts now going. Of course, Apollo was all male. Artemis is actually named after Apollo's twin sister. So this emphasis on women, and you see in the NASA verbiage now, it's to land a woman and return men to the moon. And that's a big difference from what it was not that long ago.
Just one thing, if we could go back 2 slides to this one. On the surface of the moon to the left of the human landers, you'll see there's a lot of small spacecraft. And part of Artemis is the development of commercial lunar landers. So there's a number of companies contracting to build small landers so that NASA could just purchase landings of experiments on the moon rather than having to develop their own complete mission for it.
That's exactly right. In fact, we discuss a little bit later some of the
Yeah.
people who are doing that, but the even earlier slide, I think, is that the one? No, yes, that's the one. We talked about getting out into space and rendezvous in the Lunar Gateway, but no part of Artemis specifically by NASA is about developing the equivalent of the LEM, and that's one of the roles that private companies will play. So, unlike the Apollo program that was all government all the way, this is seen to be a capability that is enabled through the Gateway and the launch system, but is intended to partner with the up and coming, and a lot of these companies are having a lot of successes in developing their hardware. I mean, we see it in launches, not only with SpaceX and with Blue Origin, but there are others as well. The Electron rocket. People are developing capabilities in space, and so part of the architecture of Artemis is to open that gate a little bit more and allow innovation through private companies.
And other countries.
And other countries,
is
for
a
sure.
difference this time around.
Yeah. So this first one, as you mentioned, is to maneuver and demonstrate the capability. Then, and that, by the way, is supposed to be happening, I think it's now. I actually thought I saw something that said it slipped to 2022.
Yeah, it depends on the booster.
Yes, everything depends on this SLS. We'll come back to that. And then the second Artemis mission will have a crew on board. 4 astronauts will fly, but they won't land.
That's right.
And here again is that diagram. Did you want to say any more on that?
Not really. I don't think there's much more to add on it, except that, again, you can see there's a lot of other maneuvering.
Okay.
There is, I guess, a transfer stage. I think that's the ICPS, if I'm correct, and it looks like they have an experiment of sending that off to out of the Earth-Moon system orbit. So just probably to check how that works.
And here's an artist's conception about what that might look like. And then finally, at long last, well, not that long, 2024, that is not that long from now, will be the first crewed mission. And I'm very grateful that you brought about the fact that NASA is aware that it's all been men and that women will be landed on the moon. That is part of the plan. Yeah. So the Artemis 3 architecture.
So now this one uses that little space station that you saw called Gateway, and that's in a very eccentric orbit around the moon. That can be maneuvered, so if different areas are targeted for landing, the orbit of the Gateway can be changed. The lunar lander would be launched on a private rocket, probably something like a Falcon Heavy or whatever else is available at the time, to the Gateway. And the Orion capsule would be launched with the SLS at a later time and would dock with the Gateway also. And then when the time's appropriate, the crew would go to the lander and land on the surface of the moon, near the South Pole in this case. Remember, Apollo could actually only land on areas fairly close to the equator of the moon. They couldn't maneuver around to polar regions or anything like that. But because Gateway will be put in a pretty much a polar orbit around the moon, any part of the moon is accessible for study.
And the poles are really important because this is the moon, the sun is shining on it. At the North Pole and the South Pole, there are deeply shadowed craters. And we have found in those very cold craters water ice. So if astronauts are going to live off the land, if there's going to be a settlement, we can't carry all of our water with us. We need water to survive, and also water can be used to develop fuel for future space missions. So we're trying to go somewhere where there's water, and that's at the poles.
And to understand what form it's in.
Yeah, we heard that. He mentioned in the last talk that we just went to this conference, and there was a session about mining, and one of the fellows from the mining company was talking about the fact that we don't even know, how can we make a plan for how to mine water? We don't even know, is it subsurface? Is it tied up in the rocks? Is it in sheets? Is it, we don't know anything about the water. So there's a lot we have to learn about that. And then the Gateway, as you can see, is developed with many different nations.
Right, and this was if everybody had their wish on what they could contract for, this is what it would look like. So lots of modules and supply modules. Canada is donating they're part of it is a robot arm. It actually is
Really?
a really interesting robot arm too. It can move itself to different parts of the station, unlike current ones which are fixed in one place and have to be moved manually. So it is an interesting arm, but this gateway itself is extremely expensive. So it's one of the things people have been looking at. Well, do we need all of that to start with? And so current plans for Artemis 3 call for sort of a real minimal version of the gateway, which would really just have something for the lunar lander and the Orion to dock to and maneuver, but beyond that, not all the other stuff yet.
So that's the basic architecture. 3 flights. On the third one, we're going to land. We have this gateway, which is an international hub. How complex or how scaled down, yet to be determined, and dependent for the U.S. part on this launch vehicle, the Space Launch System. So we don't want to take the time going through the details here, but there are different versions of that. And,
and it's roughly the size of a Saturn V. And its main engines are similar to the space shuttle's main engines, except a disposable version of them instead of the reusable version.
And here's an artist's conception of
And
it
the solid rocket boosters.
getting ready to launch. So, in fact, there is progress being made. I guess, and I might turn to you, Alan, and ask you to tell the unfortunate tale about SLS, because it's gone through many delays.
Yes.
And just earlier this year, NASA Administrator Bridenstine was down at Marshall talking about it. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what he said when he was there, except I think originally it was supposed to fly in 2018. It's now going to be 2020, 2020, depending on who you talk to. The date is all over the place. It's very expensive. There are estimates that it could cost $2 billion per launch. An entire shuttle orbiter costs $2 billion. So we're going to be spending $2 billion on a launch. And so certainly there's a controversy over that, because the private sector, people like Elon Musk with SpaceX, is saying he can launch things much cheaper than that, and that perhaps that's the direction we should be going. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. It seems to me SLS is awfully far down the road to cancel it. It's not like Ares 5 during the Constellation Program that was able to be canceled. This is going to be very hard, and in fact, SLS also stands for the Senate Launch System, because the senator from Alabama is very much wanting to have this take place. So I think the longer it takes, the more setbacks they have on the time, the more criticism it's going to get, and from in the political force and public, about shouldn't we be going with somebody like an Elon Musk, who's promising that he can reduce the launch cost radically. And I won't get into the numbers because it's hard to qualify if he's talking about just cargo launches or human launches. But trust me, he can launch a major rocket for a lot less than $2 billion.
Here's a picture of actual hardware actually being assembled, and Tony just said before we got started, there's an image today, released today, of the 4 engines mated to the rocket. So they are building things, but they are horribly behind schedule, and since it is a linchpin in the whole plan, that if SLS either doesn't get it together and or they can't work out another launch service, that will be a real hindrance to it.
Did you want to say something about the timing of the schedule a little bit? Well, this notion of going to the moon with Orion has been around for a while, and it was sort of thought that, well, we'll get around to it about 2028. But the current administration said, no, if just keep putting it off, it's never going to happen. So you got 4 years to do it. It's going to happen in 2024, or else.
Right.
Yeah, that was part of Bridenstine
Right.
at Marshall in the spring.
I would say that the pace of stuff happening has definitely increased because.
But is the funding there to support it?
That's right.
There's the rub.
Right.
Because the administrator has said he needs between $15 to $20 billion over the next 5 years, in addition to their $21 billion budget. The only increase they got this last time around was $1 billion. So there's still a big gap there. And whether or not you can do all this stuff without the adequate funding remains to be seen.
So we're going to come back to some of the management problems that they're having, but there has been a fun headline in the last month related to this, and that is that a new spacesuit has been designed. And so there was a big presentation of it. I'm going to play you a short clip, and in particular, watch the way she walks, because you'll see a tremendous amount of flexibility in the spacesuit.
Let's take a look at the spacesuits of the Artemis generation.
So look at the waist. I also think the music's kind of crazy.
So to be clear, Christine is wearing a spacesuit that will fit all of our astronauts when we go to the moon.
What's that a reference to?
Yes, I'll show you in just a second. A few more things about the dexterity.
And the gloves are key because your dexterity, show us if you can move your fingers. Can you move your, yeah, so that's really, really impressive. Another big challenge when we go to the moon is the lunar dust, which is extremely fine-grained and be very damaging for spacesuits.
Yeah, so my mentor worked on the Apollo suit, and two things I learned were zippers are bad and cables are bad. So we have no zippers and cables on this suit. What we have are bearings, so we can move easily in that pressurized suit. And what we need to do then is protect the bearings from the dust. And so we have seals in the bearings. We also are designing our environmental protection garment so that it helps mitigate the dust as well. There'll be fewer seams and new materials that keep the dust out.
So I'll come to the dust in a second, but what Tony was referencing was, and this was at Marcia Smith, who is a longtime space policy observer and writer, noted from that presentation, the suit can fit from the 1st percentile female to the 99th percentile male. Some of you may remember there was a big headline about 2 women doing a spacewalk earlier this summer, and then there was an issue with the spacesuit not fitting. It was overblown by the media to some degree. The astronaut who did not do the spacewalk actually chose to not use the suit she had planned to use. But nonetheless, there are problems with different sizes. So the idea here is that this will fit the tiniest to the largest astronaut, and they'll all work. Now, I do want to make a quick comment about the dust, because we'll come back to this, but lunar dust is bad, sticky news. It's been sitting there. We talked earlier about no erosion, so those footprints will last for a long time. Well, because there's no erosion, but the moon is being bombarded by micrometeorites, that stuff is really sharp and electrostatic. So we just heard a fair bit about it. Do you want to make any comment, Alan, about the challenges there?
Other than I hadn't realized how big of a challenge it was going to be. I mean, this is really nasty. It sounds like pretty nasty stuff. Almost to the point of I wondered, even this new suit with its bearings and things, are they going to be able to keep that dust and keep the suits pristine enough to do their work?
And the dust, something elevates it, like kicking up dust as you walk across the surface, the gravity is so low that it just takes a long time. It's floating around, and gets in everything, in gears, in wheels. They mentioned zippers. There was so much degradation on the Apollo suits that, not only does that apply to the suits, but really everything we do on the moon.
Some of those missions were 3 days of EVAs on the moon, but they couldn't probably have done a fourth because the joints on like gloves and stuff were just about worn out.
Yeah.
So
it is going to be a problem for any long-term activity on the moon because there's just no way. You can't tell the dust not to rise up off the ground, and it's a very dusty environment, and the dust is sharp and destructive.
And then when they talk about mining, I mean, this is all going to be churned up even worse than before.
So it is a real challenge. And then other news that's in the news, we mentioned a few minutes ago that the lander will have to be provided by private enterprise, and here's a picture of Jeff Bezos standing in front of a mock-up of, do you want to mention anything about
this is the Blue Moon, which is a landing platform large enough to carry an ascent stage, a stage to get people back from the moon after they land. This is he claimed that this had been in the works for I think 2 years or something before he announced it, and they've actually now fired the engine and stuff, so they're pretty much ready to build this now.
And this was a press conference, I think, just about 3 weeks ago.
I'm excited to announce that we have put together a national team to go back to the moon. Blue Origin is the prime contractor. Lockheed Martin is building the ascent stage. Northrop Grumman is building the transfer element. And Draper is doing the GNC. And this is the kind of thing that's so ambitious. It needs to be done with partners. This is the only way to get back to the moon fast.
Yeah, and this is significant, this partnership they formed, because for about the past 10, 15 years, you had this dichotomy of what they called the new space companies, the Bezos, the Musk, and Branson, versus the traditional companies. And to have this team come together of two traditional companies like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed, and the way they normally do things, and then merge with Blue Origin, I mean, a virtual upstart. They've never flown anything. I mean, in terms of this kind of a mission.
And yet Blue Origin's the prime contractor.
Yeah, they're the prime contractor. So this is huge in terms of a new way of doing business, and it's going to be fascinating to watch how that unfolds.
And I like your term, new way of doing business, because I think that really is what the moon provides for us, is this opportunity. If we're going to have a longer term vision and presence in space, it's not going to be done the way Apollo was done, with a single government and funded by a single government and just a monolithic project. It's going to involve partners, all of whom have different ways of doing business. Standards will need to be set. Simple things like procurement models. It's not simple. I shouldn't call it simple. Right. It's not. But things that we might think the technical challenges are the big ones. Well, the organizational challenges are actually every bit, if not more, of a challenge. So anyway, it remains to be seen.
And this is just a artist's conception of a blue moon, on the moon. And it could also carry robotic probes too, just to say. Now, Boeing also just came out with an announcement that they are going to develop or propose anyway, a landing and ascent module that eliminates, you maybe heard him say the transfer element. And transfer element is a separate rocket that attaches to a lunar lander to move it from the gateway to the appropriate approach path to land on the moon, and then back to the gateway, so it's a reusable part. But the Boeing lander has that sort of built into the descent stage, so it doesn't need a transfer element, so possibly there's a cost saving or something here being proposed.
But here's where that old model of competition and innovation really comes into play, because when you've got different companies saying, no, we want to be the ones to land, well, first of all, maybe both. As long as there are standards for the gateway that lets, plug and play, so to speak, There isn't any reason why one set of customers might go in one direction, another set of customers might go another direction. I'll come back to customers in a minute, but we'll just move on to, and I'm going to skip over this one, Tony.
Sure.
Just to ask the question, so with this vision, how are we doing? Well, we've already talked about the fact that SLS is delayed, and that is a problem. Also, last summer, the longtime head of the project, Bill Gerstenmaier, was very unexpectedly removed from that post. And all fall, Ken Bowersox has been in that role.
A former astronaut.
A former astronaut, worked on, did a Hubble mission. I worked at the Hubble Space Telescope Science Institute. So he actually was on one of the Hubble missions. But both Alan and I were trying to remember, there's a new fellow who was just named about 2 or 3 weeks ago into that post, so it's no longer acting. And neither of us could remember the name, which is right there kind of interesting because we're both NASA followers. And then we went looking online to the NASA website, to the news. We probably spent about 5 minutes.
Right. We couldn't find his
Could
name.
not find it, not on the NASA website. So there's a communications problem. If there's this new
Jerry, do you know
leadership.
his name by chance? Yeah.
Yep. Good luck looking it up.
Yeah, good luck. We looked.
Looked
We
it
couldn't
up.
find it.
Oh, and there's no internet in here, so you can't look it up here. But it's a challenge to any of you. You get free admission to All Space Considered if you find that name. It's free. It's not that much of a present. But anyway, and all the hearings that were happening all fall, well, we can't make that decision until we have this man in place. Can't make that decision until that management is in place. And so he's going to go out. You don't have to go out. You're not going to get reception up there either. But anyway, and so it's really, I think, unfortunate that this person's in place now. There needs to be, I mean, most of the people in this room didn't even know the program exists. So there's a real communications problem in addition to technology problems and management problems. There's an enormous communications problem. And then this from the Government Accounting Office, unrealistic schedules, cost estimates that are not transparent, and low levels of cost and schedule reserves are among the problems. It's unrealistic to think that cost and schedule growth can be prevented altogether, but better management practices can help reduce the impacts. So even I guess I don't mean to be negative, but it's not looking great. Let's just put it that way. And again, from Marcia Smith, who was at this hearing, and if you are interested, I recommend you go look. You can see the date here was September 18th. There were some remarkable comments made by NASA leadership expressing a lack of confidence in their schedule and plan. Bottom line, no one thinks we'll really be ready, but it's good to have it to provide focus. And I contrast that to, if you were here earlier today, to President Kennedy saying we're going to do this, we're going to do it by the end of the decade, we're going to overcome these challenges. And earlier this summer in our Apollo 11 program, we had one of the Apollo engineers here. We were talking about the schedule that he was on, and he just looked at me like, what are you talking about? There was no way we weren't going to do it. Our national pride depended on it. The security of the United States, our space race with the Soviets depended on it. And we weren't going to let the president down. We weren't going to let the nation down. There was no way we weren't going to land on the moon. And then you have this, well, it could happen, but it's good to provide focus. So it's a different time, and it's a worry. For this kind of
Well, and they also, during Apollo, didn't have the budget pressures that they have now. Apollo pretty much, when they needed more money, they got the money. That's not necessarily the case today.
But also they had a realistic figure for how much it was probably going to cost. It actually cost very close to it. It didn't go over the budget.
Right.
And that's what the GAO comment about budget transparency. We were having, at lunch the other day, we were discussing this, that the Apollo budget was 4% of the, or I should say NASA's budget was 4% of the federal budget at its peak. And we did a little calculation. So what, do you remember the number we came up with?
No, it's...
160 billion.
Right.
And NASA's budget right now is 20 billion. So in 1 year, if we did 4% of the federal budget in 1 year, that would give us 160 billion. So it's not just, and I don't want to give the impression it's just, oh, gee, NASA can't do anything. The nation isn't behind it. The support, look at the contrast in the budget. That's less than 0.5% of the federal budget goes to NASA now with all of the things they do, all the, Earth system science, the solar system exploration,
Aviation.
astronomy, the Hubble telescope, the Webb telescope, and somehow we're supposed to send people. We're giving them 5 years to get everybody back and do it right on 3 missions. It's a kind of a crazy goal, in my opinion.
I kind of have the feeling, actually, even if today all of the hardware were magically available, I don't know how they could train that fast, honestly.
We saw the story of all the parts that went in with the robotics, with the human spaceflight, all of the parts that went into it. So it's an interesting time because, bluntly speaking, that model, I think, is broken.
And we also had the challenge of beating the Soviets.
Yeah.
And you don't have that kind of a race going on right now. Some people are trying to create that race with China, and it's hard to understand what China's plans are. I mean, they've talked about a space station, moon, Mars, and then just this morning I read that it seems they're going to focus more on the space station first, and they don't have the money to go to the moon right away. And so some people feel, well, what we need is a good space race to get everybody behind us.
Well, I don't think that's happening. So where does that leave us? What is our future on the moon? And we're running a little bit over time, but just because we're going to finish on this slide, and there's one more. But we hear people like Elon Musk and certainly Jeff Bezos, even though they only have certain components of it, with the spirit to do it. But I think there's a kind of a consensus, and again, we were at this conference the other day, that there really needs to be a market because it isn't about the space race anymore. So why go? We don't want to do flags and footprints again. So there has to be a reason for it, and economic drivers are important. One of the leading ones, frankly, is tourism. If there can be, if you heard Alan's talk in the last hour, hotels on the moon. We had at this same session he was in, had a fellow from Caribbean cruise lines who talked about their customer base on their most expensive luxury level are willing to pay $100,000 to go on a 7-day cruise to Antarctica. That starts building some sort of basis for customers, but that is also kind of a missing component.
Yeah, well, I keep thinking of Elon Musk's Starship because that can carry anything pretty much, and presumably for a low price. And I would think actually that would inspire like a fast food company or something to want to get in on that to provide food and stuff in an entertaining way to passengers, like that Hilton bar that you showed.
At this conference we were at, there was a whole session about who are the new non-traditional players going to be, and it was that type of thing. The other thing about Elon Musk is he has announced in the same time frame that NASA says we're going to get back to the moon with the first woman and men again, he has said he's going to launch a Japanese billionaire on a mission around the moon by 2022. And that person wants to take along 8 artists, which I'm fascinated by because for the Spaceflight Participant Program, after the teacher in space, journalist in space, we were looking at an artist in space. And the fact that this Japanese gentleman wants to take artists along and have them come back and communicate, I find fascinating. But if he pulls that off and NASA isn't getting closer to landing on the moon, that's going to be a very interesting dichotomy.
Well, it seems to me, and I'm purely speculating, that I'm going to open up to questions, is that if we're going to do this, and you've brought this up many times, the cost to get to orbit has to come down. But once we reach a threshold where the cost to orbit becomes within reach, that people can develop things like orbiting space station hotels, the number of people that would want to travel, and then is a whole market. How do you brush your teeth in space? They had to solve that because Procter and Gamble was one of the, you may never have thought about that, but you can't just take your toothpaste and toothbrush because it'll be a mess in there. So they'll have to develop, every little thing. How do you, certainly food services and beds for a hotel in space and everything. There's a market there. There's money to be made from companies that would support a industry in orbit, which can then start to build a platform from which that can expand. And now those hotels will take you around the moon, and pretty soon they'll be able to orbit with Gateway, and so. It's incremental, but the really key issue is that first getting the threshold of launch services, which is coming within reach by these private companies. So, and then the last thing I wanted to say is that also came out of this conference, I think in an interesting way, in conferences I've been to before that haven't, is the absolute necessity that whatever it is we do up there needs to benefit us here. We are not in the situation that we were of the generation who came out of the Colliers and, the vision of, we're all going to live on the moon and travel into space, the International Geophysical Year sort of thing. That we now recognize that the issues challenging us here back at home are vast, and whatever, so and we're not going to escape them by going into space, that space needs to be a part of the solutions back here. So with that, I know we're a little over, but I'd still like to ask if there are any questions in the audience.
I have one. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's the view on the military?
The question is...
So there's been some talk on Twitter that there would be a military presence in space, and clearly the military budget's quite big. I just wondered if there was any push from that direction.
So the question is, what about the military in space? We've been hearing more about it. I think you're probably referencing the Space Force. What role would that play?
It's unclear at this point because they're still kind of debating what is the Space Force and where is it going to be headquartered, who's going to lead it. And the military hasn't been very out front when it comes to space exploration these days. And so that's a great question. I don't know what their plan is. They certainly have a larger budget than NASA does. They spend much more money on space than NASA does.
And you heard people talking about the Space Force protecting America's assets in space. Not so much that they're going out there to wage war with aliens or anything, but that, increasingly life on Earth is dependent on our assets in space, our GPS, our communications, all of the things that are there. And so that's how I hear discussions about the Space Force, not that there's going to be Imperial stormtroopers on large cargo carriers, but and so I don't hear any discussion of them taking a role in an exploration way so much as a protection way, but of course.
But to protect the access to space by our country, I think is how it's usually put. Because China has a similar policy towards their access to things. They want to protect it with a military backup. So.
There was a question over here, and then I see two more, so we'll come back to you. But
did you find it?
Douglas Lavero,
Okay. Did it say where he came from?
DOD.
Oh, okay.
Oh, interesting.
There you go.
There you go.
So this was an answer just to put it on the live stream. Douglas Navarro?
Douglas Lavero.
Lavero. Oh gosh, isn't it?
L-O-V-E-R-R-O.
L-E-V.
L-O-V.
L-O-V. E-R-R-O.
Thanks.
Thank you. The new Associate Administrator for Space Exploration Operations, I think is the directorate's name. Yes.
Given the big price tag that you have laid out, why do we expect that the knights in shining armor, Musk and Bezos, will come to the rescue and then throw tens of billions of dollars at this problem when the American people apparently are not ready to do it?
So the question is, why would entrepreneurs like Musk and Bezos throw billions of dollars into developing this when the American people are not behind it. Did I capture your question properly? I have an answer, but I don't want to.
You can start.
Number one, because they've got the money,
Yeah.
and number two, because they've got the dream. I mean, both those guys believe to their core in this vision and the importance of this vision. I hear Elon Musk, and I got to say, I agree with him, talking about how essential it is for us to make sure that human life and human consciousness expands off this planet so that it is preserved in the history of the universe. Because ultimately, our planet is vulnerable. I mean, bad day for the dinosaurs 65 million years ago would be bad news for us, no matter what we tried to do, burrowing underground or whatever. And so it's sort of an insurance policy that humanity does not vanish from the universe. Yeah. That sounds wacky, but that's what motivates people like this.
And Musk constantly talks about how we need to become a multi-planet species. It's in all of his talks. And Bezos is pretty much the same. They both have a inherent belief that we need to expand beyond Earth into the solar system.
And if I may also, the person who seems to be paying for Musk's biggest rocket, the Starship, as it's called, the one that will carry tourists around the moon, is the tourist who wants to go around the moon. He's paying for the development of it. But if that's developed, it actually will, it could, I've heard, knock the cost of launching things into space down by a factor of maybe 1,000.
Yeah.
So that's how it's being paid for.
And it is true that once that barrier is shattered, there is money to be made. That I don't believe is their primary reason. I really do believe they're true believers. But there is money to be made once we get past that threshold where this whole industry can come into life.
Related to what we're talking about, is Virgin Galactic, Richard Branson, interested in this Artemis rigmarole or not? Are they interested or not?
The question is, what about, I'm just doing it
Yeah,
for the live stream,
yeah.
what about Richard Branson?
He seems to be more focused on suborbital flight. He's many, many years behind his original schedule, but he thinks that there's money to be made there, and his company's also focusing on a satellite capability of some kind. I'm sorry, I don't know the details on that.
That's one dropped from a 747 jet. Yeah, Virgin Orbit, which is also
Virgin
based
Orbit,
in LA
yeah.
here. Yeah.
Yeah. So his focus is a little different.
Question there.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about how there being a market for this and tourism and how it seems to be a lot of Bezos and Musk, but I guess I'm just curious about, don't you think there's kind of an inherent danger in kind of having all of this be reliant on billionaires who only became billionaires by like kind of taking advantage of like a lot of people? Like we've heard about like how Bezos treats like Amazon workers in his warehouse. So like if you're thinking about this from a business point of view, I just don't really, are you guys worried about like how they're going to cut corners? Because if their main objective is to be like making money, and you said that like, oh, they're true believers, but like corporations are like a strong force, and maybe they are true believers, but like if we have corporations be the face of this endeavor, there's a risk that the people are going to cut corners because it's not really about learning things for the sake of learning it so much as it is about how much money can I wring from this one tourist.
Let me try to encapsulate your question. Is there a risk at having, and tell me if I've done it right, having corporations take such a lead role in this when essentially the corporation profit motive may inspire them to cut corners, increasing risk, making it more dangerous, and that sort of thing. Is that?
That's pretty much the sum of it.
Do you have a response to that?
Well, I heard when I used to work for the Zero Gravity Corporation, which is the company that does the parabolic flights with a Boeing airplane, people said, "Oh, well, you guys are going to cut corners to make more money." The fact is, we couldn't afford to cut corners because if we aren't safe, if we don't deliver a safe product, we're not going to be in business. They're not going to be in business. So I'm not quite as concerned about the cutting corner part of your question. I think your question's excellent, though, in terms of are we putting too much confidence in so few people to determine this large of a future? The only thing I can tell you is at this again, I keep going back to this conference on space
2 days
settlements
ago.
we were at,
Yeah.
was somebody said, oh, just wait, there's at least 3 to 4 new companies and new individuals that we haven't even heard about yet that are going to get into this game. So maybe through more competition, your problem or your concern will be less of an issue. And by the way, for the concern about or the question about military, I had the impression that some of these companies that this guy's talking about have been heavily involved with some super secret military stuff that's going on.
So maybe it will be unveiled. I think we have time for one more question because, and before you ask your question, because, shameless plug, we want to get Alan out there to do a book signing of his wonderful book that's available at our bookstore, See You in Orbit, Our Dream of Spaceflight. So we're going to take one more question and then we'll let Alan go up so you can meet him, get a copy of the book, have him sign it, and so forth. So yes, your question.
My question is, have we determined what we're going to do with the International Space Station? Because I know the United States, we're dependent on spending millions of dollars paid to Russia so that we can go to the International Space Station with the cosmonaut Soyuz capsules. So, I mean, when we're looking at it from a government standpoint, that was our only option, yeah, but we're also supporting a government that maybe could counter our government's mission.
Well, we've been paying the Russians, I think it's 85, I've heard anywhere from 75 to $85 million per seat. With Musk and the Dragon 2, that cost, he says, is going to come down to $50 million, and the Boeing Starliner was also supposed to be in that neighborhood, but this GAO report says it might be more like 90, which is more than we're paying the Russians. They just had some legislation introduced, I don't know if it has passed, to keep the space station going until I think it was
2030.
2030.
Yeah.
And that's a $2 to $3 billion a year operations cost on top of all this other stuff.
So I absolutely hate to say this when we just had some people walk in and sit down, but I want to thank you for joining us today. This is actually the end of this program. What?
Westchester Senior Group.
Oh, lovely. Welcome. But we are, in fact, ending this program, and we want to thank you all and invite you back for the Apollo 13 celebration in April. If you missed any of the talks earlier today, it's all posted on our live stream and on our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle, I should have put it up here, is All Space Considered. Or on Instagram or on Facebook, All Space Considered, and you'll see posts when we put the edited videos up for you to enjoy. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to Alan Ladwig for being here today, and have a great day at Griffith Observatory.
Yeah.